Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bolzakelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, and I'm joined this week by my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy for Catholic Studies Academy. Today we'll be talking about the character, place, and value of medieval philosophy, not only for the Catholic tradition, but also for Western culture as a whole. Dr. Smith, you and I have both spent quite a lot of time in the intellectual world of medieval philosophy,
Sure.
and I think we've both been a little irked at the dismissive attitude that
Hmm.
today's scholars can often manifest toward the medieval tradition.
Sure.
They call it the Dark Ages because they imagine that somehow it's devoid of the light of reason
Hmm.
before it returned in the Enlightenment.
Right.
And they call it, the Middle Ages, like it's a middle child or something, a cultural middle child, to be ignored,
Mhm.
bookended by more important periods of time. So I know that's not your view, and it's not my view.
Mhm.
I thought maybe you can get us started with a few of your own thoughts about this problem and how we ought to think about the Middle Ages.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. As I shared with you recently, I was able to um, spend some time teaching medieval philosophy this last semester,
Hmm.
which was a real blessing and a real privilege and a delight because it gives you the opportunity to teach, students one of the areas that have the greatest expertise in. As you said about yourself and about me, we've both spent a great deal of time studying this period and studying the thought of this period, which I think is really a wonderful thing to do. I mean, to find a period that you like in the history of philosophy and that you can really delve into for years,
Hmm.
right? Even decades, is really a pleasure. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to spend time exploring. I mean, whether it's medieval philosophy or the philosophy of China or something like that. I mean, it's just
Uh,
great to find something that you can really delve into. And I think one of the indicators of the value of medieval philosophy is that you can study it for decades and still have more to learn.
hmm.
Right. Like I have a very good knowledge. I would say I have a good knowledge of, say, William of Ockham,
Hmm.
but I have a whole lot to learn
Yeah.
at the same time. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I've literally studied medieval philosophy and taught it for decades, and I know that there's areas where I can improve my knowledge
Yeah.
and grow to be a better scholar. And that shows you right away something about, wow, there's actually a lot here. If you actually get into it and give it an opportunity, and my students, I think, experience this over the semester, there's a lot more here than you think
Hmm.
if you're just coming to it as from a average sort of normal perspective. And the things that are there are actually more relevant than you might think, albeit different, maybe than the normal philosophical discourse or what often passes for philosophical discourse today. So I think the medieval period, like a lot of other periods, I'm kind of influenced a little bit by Hegel on this point, but also Etienne Gilson, that I think that different periods of the history of philosophy have specific spirits or
Hmm.
specific characters, right? I think there is such a thing as Enlightenment philosophy, like early modern philosophy is a thing. And we're not exactly, although ideas from, say, early modern philosophy continue to be discussed and engaged with and continue to be influential, we're not doing early modern philosophy, I think, in the same way anymore, right?
Yeah.
We're no
Right.
longer those salon gentlemen or people who are pre or post French Revolution or right in the sort of the heyday of the early scientific revolution, right? We're just not those people. We've had a lot of history happen in between then, and that's affected philosophy. Similarly, I think medieval philosophy has its own spirit and its own character that distinguishes it from other periods of philosophy. And so, and for that reason, among others, um, it is something that's worthy of study.
Yeah. So I think we can actually, even when you look at medieval philosophy, it's a really broad swath. And when you talk about the spirit of it, maybe we can talk about an overarching spirit of a genus that we might
Mhm.
call medieval
Yes,
philosophy,
it's a nice way of putting
um, or even something higher up in the taxonomy than that. And then we can talk about, species and
it. Hmm.
um, the. So let's just say, here's me off the top of my head. I'm
Okay.
thinking, when I think of when you think of medieval philosophy, the first your go-to is somewhere around the 13th century. That's
Mm.
probably where most people kind of
Sure,
land.
sure.
And that's, the time of Aquinas and Bonaventure, right?
Hmm.
Um, but on the other hand, we know that a great deal happened on either side of that divide.
Sure.
And that period in the 13th century was kind of a watershed moment in the development of medieval philosophy,
Right.
the rise of high scholasticism, the
Hmm.
age of the Summa, um, and a generation after Thomas, in the beginning of really the I mean the tail end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century was the time of Duns Scotus.
Hmm.
Um, and then you could push even further, right? Where do you draw the line? Where is the
Hmm.
end of this philosophical period? Is it the time of the Reformation? Is it later than that? Um, and going back earlier,
Hmm.
certainly we would put St. Anselm of Canterbury in the medieval world, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, we would put Peter Lombard in the medieval world. But they're not really quite at the scholastic period. They're just at the beginning of the scholastic period, really, right? When you think about
Sure.
it. Um, but of course, they had tremendous influence on the development of scholasticism.
Hmm.
Um, but before them, right, going back all the way, you date it in your essay, you want to put it at sort of maybe the Carolingian period.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at a standard book, and I don't, I try to not be over, persnickety about being critical of historians on these demarcation lines because they are
Yeah,
just
they're
rough.
pretty arbitrary sometimes.
Yeah, right. It's just you're doing the best you can. The medieval period very often is said to be from the year 500 to the year 1500, right? So that's a
Yeah, that's too
thousand
broad.
years, right? It's a huge period,
Yeah.
right? Now, roughly, you've got the fall of Rome, right, on one end, or sort of final fall of the Western Roman Empire, and on the other, you have the emergence of the Renaissance. Um, I think that that's not bad as a way of demarcating it. I do think the fall of the Roman Empire is very important, obviously, in terms of the sort of Western history timeline.
Mhm.
And I think it's very important in terms of understanding medieval philosophy and medieval civilization, really.
Mhm.
Um, Along with my thesis about periods of medieval philosophy having particular ethos or spirits. I think the same thing of civilizations, right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
there was a thing called medieval civilization. It didn't exist at certain periods, and then it did, and then it slowly ceased to exist, right?
Mhm.
We don't live in medieval civilization anymore, but it was real. Um, I actually like ending the medieval period around 1500 because of the emerging predominance of Renaissance learning, which was a different educational program at its heart. I mean, we can think about the Renaissance in a lot of different ways. You can even think about it from a military perspective, actually, which is funny sometimes to people, but we can.
Mhm.
Um, but one very good way of thinking about the Renaissance is as a distinct educational program.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, go on. I'll just finish
yeah,
that thought, and then I have a little
and
question.
I think then on the other end of the spectrum,
Mhm.
that's kind of why I want to put the Carolingian Renaissance as the beginning of medieval philosophy,
Uh-huh.
because I think there you get this the first sort of flowering of a particular educational program, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that if you think about medieval philosophy as an educational kind of program, project would be better, endeavor, right? Um, then I think that's really where that emerges. You brought together just enough scholars in the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne. Um, they were located in one area. They were able to collaborate, right? They're able to be more productive than they would have been independently. What does that sound like? That sounds a little bit like a university, right?
Right, right.
Now, I'm not claiming that it was a university in the way we understand that, but it had some of that feel to it, right? And out of that, scholars spread and scholarship spread and reading spread and the liberal arts spread. Now, it's not as if they were totally absent outside of the Carolingian court, but they weren't, I would say, as energetic, widespread, or deeply practiced. And I think that
Hmm.
that really energized it. So I kind of think of medieval civilization really as starting with Charlemagne. He's coronated, crowned 800. This particular medieval civilization. What passes from 500 to about 800 is pretty rough period. If you were to call anything the Dark Ages, it might be that
Yeah,
period,
right. You'd
because you
call
do
that the
have real
Dark
decline.
Ages, but not really for intellectual reasons as much as for cultural and political reasons, right? I mean,
Sure.
you had chaos.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
had a civilization that had no cohesive, there was no, the Roman Empire was in ruins, and
Hmm.
what's holding the world together at a cultural level.
Hmm.
Um, so I want to push back a little bit, though, um, and I could also kind of see a response in this, but in the end period of the Middle
Hmm.
Ages, um, when I look at the Protestant Reformation, my thinking about this has changed over the years. I used to sort of buy into a really Enlightenment understanding of the demarcation there, where the Protestant Reformation occurred, um, because it involved a shift in the way people thought. And I'm not really sure that's really true anymore. I mean, I know that there are obviously shifts,
Hmm.
but the more I've come to understand about that period of time and what the issues really were, at least from a theological perspective, um, there's actually a tremendous amount of continuity in early Protestant thought
Sure.
with the Western Catholic theological tradition.
Hmm.
It's not as easy to just sort of point the finger and say, and that's where they jumped the rails.
Hmm.
Um, I do stand by the idea that errors were made, but I find those errors to be a lot easier to understand than I used to.
Sure.
Um, and when you picture, Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, if you know anything about that historical period intellectually, right, the life of the
Hmm.
university, you know that he was attempting to engage in a medieval disputation.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that.
And in fact, the legend that he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in a public demonstration is is really a fiction. That's not actually true.
Mm.
Um, he circulated those 95 Theses to a group of colleagues,
Hmm.
and he was offering them for sort of like preliminary consideration,
Hmm.
in anticipation of a public debate.
Sure.
But he never intended for them to be made public right away, and he felt betrayed that
Hmm.
someone
So
had
that's
made
a
it public
yeah,
prematurely.
yeah, yeah. So I agree with you, Rich, in terms of the that early period in the Reformation and how there is a lot of continuity with the medieval civilization beforehand.
Mhm.
But you look at some of the differences, right? Well, he was betrayed by what? By somebody getting a hold of it and putting it into a printing press,
Uh-huh.
right? Well, no, was no printing press in the 13th century,
Yeah.
and more importantly, there was no audience for a printing press. Right? Literacy was very low in the 13th century and pretty circumscribed to a small kind of group of people,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Literacy rates by the time you get to the 15th century and the 16th century are up a good bit among this sort of rising middle class, urban middle class, right? Um, So there is a change, I think, in the intellectual landscape. Was Luther himself exactly a propagator of that? I don't think so, necessarily. But the intellectual world, the intellectual milieu is changing in significant
Hmm.
ways. Because who's a contemporary of Luther? In a way, you're right. Luther's um, kind of traditional, right, in his intellectual setting. But like, who's a good contemporary? Erasmus, right?
Yeah, right.
Erasmus is a
Very different kind of thinker.
contemporary, and he's doing a very different kind of intellectual work, right?
Right,
That
right.
I would call Renaissance.
Yeah.
And that's not even really a criticism. I just think it's just a difference um, in the way in which
So
they.
these transitions, right, there's a certain gradualness to them. They're not
Sure.
exactly as abrupt. It's not not a like a cliff you fell off, right?
Yeah, I agree. What I would say is that the scholastic method lasted
Hmm.
longer than medieval civilization,
Right, right,
right?
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if that weren't true, if we would either have to say that scholasticism wasn't really medieval, which
Right.
I think would be ridiculous,
Right.
or we would say that the Middle Ages continued until like the 17th century or so.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yeah. So I think you have to sort of recognize that happened. And I own it. And when I say they were still doing medieval philosophy in a sense, but also I think they were kind of carrying it on sort of in a different setting, right? In
Yeah.
that post-Renaissance or that
So how would you
Renaissance setting.
characterize someone? So how would you characterize somebody like William of Ockham then? Because his
It,
thinking is shifting pretty hard in a new direction.
it is. So I'm going to say something very negative, and then I'm going to try to give a long explanation for why I'm going to say something very negative, right?
Uh,
Because I think that William Ockham is brilliant. I think that he is a medieval philosopher, right, in the sense of a man engaged in that tradition
uh-huh.
and participating in that tradition. I would see him as either a dissident or a sort of beginning of an unraveling, or part of maybe better say this, part of the gradual unraveling of that tradition.
Hmm.
Um, Now that's a claim that I'll have to defend, and I'll try to defend it with a definition. All right.
All right, that's very scholastic of you.
There you go. So I've spoken already a little bit about the idea that there's a different that medieval philosophy, like any historical period, has its own character, its own civilization, like civilizational spirit,
Hmm.
right? And I want to claim, much like I think medieval civilization in general, that medieval philosophy is its spirit, its character is that of creative retrieval, right?
Hmm.
That is what they're doing. So let me try to explain the two halves of that, because I see that description as having two parts: creative and retrieval,
Hmm.
right? So retrieval, this is the part about medieval philosophy that when you're studying in the books, you have to remember that these are real men in a real place, right, with real historical circumstances around them.
Hmm.
And the men of, say, England, which admittedly was on the sort of fringes of the Roman Empire, but still, was part of the Roman Empire at one time. In the early medieval period, that post 500 period, after the empire begins to decline and withdraw, right? There were men there, even Christian men, right? You think of people like Saint Bede, right, and so forth, who could look at the world around them, the physical world around them,
Hmm.
and see things that they could not recreate,
Yeah,
right?
right.
They could see, like, um, leftover aqueducts. They could see even baths or buildings, right? That the men that they were there still couldn't make anymore, right?
Yeah, they were astonished at the engineering. They
That's right. Yeah, and
awesome
and then
knowledge. Yeah.
some of the mosaics were beautiful, and they couldn't make those.
Hmm.
They had their own art, and I don't want to sort of downplay that, but what they saw there, they couldn't recreate that. right?
Hmm.
And uh, maybe that'd be a startling experience, right? It's kind of dystopian, right? And
Yeah.
I think there's an edge of that we need to keep. I think it is good that scholars have pushed back in recent years on the Dark Ages as, myth is sort of like uh, overly generalized and so forth. But there is a period, right, where you do see steep declines, like what I would call civilizational declines, right?
Hmm.
Urbanization falls apart, food production falls off the chart. There's declining population. I mean, that's a civilization ending. And I do
Yeah.
think you have to recognize that classical civilization in the West ended, right? It fell apart, right? At a certain point. And that's rough when
Yeah.
it happens, right? We've never been through anything like that in our own time to that degree, I would say,
Hmm.
at least on a physical material level. Although maybe somebody could dispute that, but I'll leave that aside. Um, the Certainly that like declining population sort of thing, just I mean, it's a terrible thing, right? So you know, there were still learned men, right? They were in monasteries, things like that. There wasn't a complete loss of classical learning because the one classical institution that survived, right, at the fall of the Roman Empire was the Catholic Church, right?
Right.
Sometimes people don't think of the Catholic Church as a classical world institution, but clearly it was. And if you think even about the fact that actually when the Western Roman Empire fell, it was a Christian empire, right?
Yeah.
The empire had been Christian for a long time at that
Hmm.
point, you know.
Hmm.
So I think it's kind of worth remembering that. And those churchmen, those monks who survived that fall, kept the learning that they had received and passed it on, right? So I think that's really important, right? Element there. At the same time, I wouldn't say that they just merely preserve the classical world, right? I think working on an essays, about this, and the kind of metaphor I like to use is sort of like a shipwreck, right?
Hmm.
And you have sort of the flotsam and jetsam of a shipwreck, and you're going out there to the beach to try to pick up what you can, right? And you do find some things that are really valuable, right? But it's still not the ship, right?
Hmm.
The ship has been destroyed, never to be rebuilt, right? Like that ship is gone, right?
Yeah.
But you did find a compass. You did
Hmm.
find some food. You did find, some things that are going to help you, right? So that's the retrieval part, right? I think that the medieval philosophers, I think medieval people in the early stage recognized that they had gone through a civilizational collapse and were interested in rebuilding something, right? I remember there was a book that I had read in undergraduate. It was something like The Memory of Rome. It
Hmm.
was a small book, actually. It was one of those really great small books where the scholar was actually mainly interested in how people remembered Rome for about 500 to 800 years after, right? And it
Uh,
was just really like it was just kind of eye-opening, the degree to which people thought about Rome, romanticized Rome, idealized Rome. Just, I mean, like it was this golden age in lots of ways in their thought, right?
yeah. It's
Isn't that
funny how we
interesting?
don't, in our time, very few people have similar ideas, right? I mean, you actually, well, you will find in Catholic circles, I suppose, some people who think that way about the Middle Ages,
Sure.
about the
Mm,
period of scholasticism. And you'll find in Protestant thinking some people who feel that way about the early Protestant period. But
mm.
as a general rule in our culture today, we don't think 500 years in the past, right? I
No.
mean, we think,
I don't
we
think we
barely think
think much
about,
more like 5 months in the
yeah,
past
we barely
anymore.
think about the previous generation.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think yeah, certainly, yes. Honoring the past is part of something we don't do as modern men, right? I mean, there's some exceptions, but the exceptions kind of show the rule, right? You're allowed to sort of honor World War II,
Uh,
right?
and even
And
that is kind of
and
fading
the
away now.
veterans who fought there, but that's kind of it,
Hmm.
And then the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and things like that. But that's the past that's acceptable. Most of the rest of it's not.
Yeah, but in the Middle Ages, the past was absolutely acceptable and
Yes,
important, right? And it's part
yes,
of their mentality
that's right.
that tradition deserves to be passed on, and if you
Sure.
can't pass it on, it needs to be recovered.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So that's that retrieval part, right? Where they're
Yeah.
really trying to retrieve as much classical learning as they can. And it is really interesting. You can trace a pretty programmatic attempt in the Carolingian Empire to propagate the liberal arts specifically,
Hmm.
and in terms of the trivium and the quadrivium, right? Like Charlemagne, for all of it, Charlemagne's a fascinating person. I think probably one of the most important people in Western history, to be honest. But he wasn't deeply educated, but he was educated enough, and he had a tremendous appreciation for education as a form of building civilization, building this empire that he had in his imagination, and that the
Hmm.
Pope of the time had in his imagination, right? Which was he's going to be the new Roman emperor, right? This German out in Germany,
Hmm.
right, is going to be the new Roman emperor. But very clearly, right, saw the importance of this retrieval operation, right? So that retrieval is taking these things up. And if you read much medieval philosophy, of course, you run into ancient philosophy all the time, right?
Hmm.
You're going to be reading about Neoplatonism. You're going to be reading Aristotle at a certain point. You're going to be reading some of the great later. You're going to be reading some of the great Islamic commentaries, that kind of thing. So there's going to be a lot of ancient philosophy that is still present, right, in medieval debates. The debate on universals, I mean, it goes back to Aristotle and Plato, right?
Right.
It's not the exact same way that they
Hmm.
debated it, but that's a big part of it. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that it's not merely an attempt to rebuild Rome.
Yeah.
I mean,
So, one of the really interesting things that we find in the Middle Ages is the hunt for a philosophical paradigm,
mhm,
right? And now, for the first part of the Middle Ages, Neoplatonism was just taken for granted.
sure.
That had been the philosophical tradition dominant in the church since the patristic period. And I guess they sort of just stuck with that for as long as they could, for as
Mhm,
long as it was serviceable. Um, Even though the Neoplatonic tradition has its definite pitfalls, by the time you got to the Middle Ages, the church had worked through most of those and
yeah,
figured out ways to navigate them.
right. Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's important
so
to think about their sources. Sorry.
as a philosophical paradigm on which to build theological discussion,
Mhm,
it was pretty well serviceable by that point,
sure.
but it wasn't perfect, right? And of course, nothing is. There is no philosophical system that's perfect. But the discovery of Aristotle kind of opened up new ways of talking about the relationship between the material and spiritual world
Mhm,
that we couldn't really do justice to in um, a Platonic setting.
right.
And but it also came with a huge number of new pitfalls that the church was unable to, like we couldn't predict exactly what heresies were going to come, right?
Sure.
In other words, we knew how to deal with the problems in Neoplatonism. We had no idea really how to deal yet with the problems that would come from Aristotelianism. And so there
Mhm,
was this huge controversy when people began to
sure.
bring Aristotle into the theological debates.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. That's true for sure. I mean, obviously that the that controversy culminates in the condemnations, right? Of 1277, if I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah.
and and that's just shortly after Aquinas's death. And there's a kind of you know there's a kind of like okay, there's a kind of like well, we're going to step back a little bit from Aristotle, and you do see about kind of a there's a gap really between the 1277 condemnations and the work of Scotus. Uh, and there's kind of the explicit work on Aristotle, some of that kind of recedes, right?
Mhm.
Now that said, certainly the Dominicans kept that up in the work of Aquinas
Mhm.
and of Albert the Great, especially. The work of Aquinas was seen as especially important in terms of its moral content for confessors.
Hmm.
So that part of the Summa, was it the Secunda Secunda, right, was very important, right, because that had the morality, right, that Dominican preachers would need in terms of hearing confessions. But yeah, you're right. That certainly did introduce difficulties. But one of the things that's really interesting then about the medieval, what I would call medieval philosophy, right,
Hmm.
is that it didn't fall apart completely, right?
Yeah.
It did actually continue, and like a lot of some of the excellent elements. I think the Bonaventure Aquinas are really great because they have a lot. They have some Aristotelianism in there, but they don't sort of totally neglect the Neoplatonic uh, background either.
Right.
The longer you go, I think the Neoplatonism fades more. But then you do have sources like Meister Eckhart and people like that who kind
Hmm.
of pick it up in different strains. Now, I don't particularly not a fan of Meister Eckhart, but I recognize kind of what he's doing there. The uh, so I think that goes to the strength of the tradition, right? That it was able to incorporate eventually, roughly, but
Hmm.
eventually, incorporate new sources,
Yeah.
right? And even expanding language base. Most of that expanding language base was not direct, but they had enough translators that they were beginning to expand, their ability to sort of read outside of their own sort of linguistic limitations. So I think that was very important and part of, that creativity, right? That I think SE is part of the medieval spirit, right? So
Yeah.
part of its retrieval, which is the recovery of things from ancient Rome and the classical world, but then also being creative. That is, this was done by a new class of philosophers, right? All of these philosophers were Christians, right? At least the ones I'm focused on in Europe, right? Uh,
Hmm.
these were all Christians. Most of them were churchmen. Most of them did their work within an ecclesiastical setting. The universities were all ecclesiastical institutions. Um, the great sponsors. There were royal sponsors for sure, but the church was the predominant sponsor of this form of learning. So it has a different character, like just like I was talking about Thomas. With Thomas, the part that was the most famous or most useful in the early medieval, or like initially after his death, right, was the part that had to do with being a priest and a confessor, right? That's a
Hmm.
Christian thing, right? That's a Catholic thing. And so important to see the newness that's there, right? This is a newness in medieval philosophy that is very much directed to Christianity, but not just in an abstract theological sense, in that sense, for sure, but as part of building a civilization, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's something that people don't often get. Medieval philosophy was an educational program, a reforming program, an improving program, like other sorts of educational movements. They saw themselves as bettering, this is maybe hard for us to see, but as bettering their society, right?
Yeah.
In the practice of the liberal arts, in philosophy, in theology, in law, right? And then in medicine, right? They saw their program as creating a new civilization or as part of a new civilization. And one way I like to put this is these are philosophy can be kind of inside the institutions or outside the institutions. This is very much insider philosophy, right?
Hmm.
These guys are not dissidents on the fringe, right? These guys are in the institutions, right? The primary institutions of their civilization. That means that I see them very much as being uh, pro-institutional. We're building up these institutions. We're
Hmm.
building up civilization here, right? In a positive way.
Right.
That doesn't
But
mean they
then,
agree with each other, right?
yeah.
Of course, right? They clashed, but that kind of overarching sort of positive mission is, I think, what inspired a great deal of medieval philosophy.
Yeah. So let me talk a couple of those issues, right? Number one is when I mentioned the Renaissance, when I mentioned the Protestant Reformation earlier, right? One of the things you see in the Protestant Reformation is the introduction of suspicion of the institution of the church,
Sure.
right? So, for the medievals,
Mhm.
the church it's taken for granted that the church
Yeah,
is given
it's a
by Christ,
fact.
that the institutional structure is is maybe, they understood that there's some malleability to the institutional structure
Sure,
of the church, but the church has to have an institutional structure, and the church, qua church, is necessary for salvation.
sure.
So that's an attitude toward the church that we see suddenly shift during the
Mm,
Protestant Reformation. And
mm,
from a theological point of view, you can see that in the early Protestant confessions, the question of the church gets a tremendous amount of attention,
mm.
right? More than even the debates about soteriology, right? How people
Interesting.
end up getting saved. The central issue is really ecclesiology.
Mm,
Um, now, that just shows you, it goes to this point that you were making about the idea that in the Middle Ages, people are working from within the institutions,
mm,
and they see that institutional structure out of which they move as necessary for the salvation of the world, right? Not
mm.
only in the order of grace, but in the order of nature too. It seems as if in order to rebuild civilization, you just need these institutions. Where
Right,
else are you going to turn?
right. Yeah, yeah.
So that's the first thing I would say. Um, the other thing I would point to is the richness of the debate. Now you had, we talk about the spirit. You were talking about the spirit of medieval philosophy, and
Mm,
I want to point out there that when we say that, right, we're not suggesting that medieval philosophy is one thing, as if everybody
mm.
was Thomas or everybody was Bonaventure.
Right.
No, there's actually a tremendous variation within medieval
Sure,
thought, but there's an underlying ethos that drives the debate. Though there are
right.
competing schools with, in many cases, deeply dividing controversies, right?
Sure.
Nonetheless, they're all sort of engaged in a similar project.
That's what I think. Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, I would see them as constructive, as synthesizers and systematizers, right?
Hmm.
These are philosophers in the positive vein, right? You know, you look at the great critics in the history of philosophy, right? That's another way to be a philosopher. And I don't want to say that that's not philosophy, right? You can be a great critical philosopher, right?
Hmm.
Um, but that's a different, I would say that's a different spirit, a little bit of a different mindset than being a systematizer, right? A
Hmm.
system builder. Obviously, these are going to be interwoven in anybody's real practice, right? Of philosophy, but you can put your emphasis in one place or the other, your energy, so to speak, right? And I think, when you look at Bonaventure and Thomas and Scotus and Alexander Hales, philosophers like that, you're looking at system builders, right? They're trying to
Yeah.
do something positive and
Hmm.
constructive, right? Obviously, they're engaged in criticism, but that's not their primary bent, right?
Right, right.
You know, uh, I think, Descartes, for all of he probably wanted to be a constructive philosopher and thought about himself that way. His primary legacy is negative, right? And
Yeah,
critical.
poor guy. I mean, he's very explicit in saying that that's not his intention.
I know. He's even
But
actually trying to overcome skepticism, right?
yeah.
Poor guy. But by going for this, sort of absolute certainty, right? In this kind of a priori rational way, he ends up in this position where he undermines the very thing he's trying to do. But you can see a lot of, I mean, I think of the greatest modern philosophers, Immanuel Kant,
Hmm.
and I mean, he's overwhelmingly critical, right? He does want to build a system, but again, the legacy of German philosophy after Kant is, well, gosh, these critical points are so good, we can't really like rely on the positive content. And so the German philosophers keep trying to find a positive
Yeah,
system that's still consistent with the critical movements within Kant.
right,
And they find that
right.
eventually they can't do it, you know.
Yeah. I
But
mean, the
anyhow,
phenomenological movement is actually attempting to accomplish that,
sure, yeah. Mhm.
right? I mean, if you when you read Karol Wojtyła, for one, it's like among others, right? But I happen to have read quite a bit of Karol Wojtyła,
Mhm.
and but you could totally see that dialogue with Kant. He's really
Right.
conscious about
Yeah, I
trying
mean,
to.
again, Kant is great,
Uh,
uh, but there's a different spirit there, right? I think to some degree, and I think that's kind of true of the Enlightenment in general. Now, I earlier said something negative about William Ockham. This is why I think of William Ockham as a dissident or fringe medieval
Hmm.
philosopher. In saying that, I teach William of Ockham in my medieval philosophy class. Don't
Hmm.
misunderstand, right? I think he's very important. I don't think, though, he really embodies the spirit of medieval philosophy.
Yeah.
Or if you want to say that it is, maybe he does in sort of in its declining period, right? Um, that is, he is one of a number of later medieval thinkers who are much more skeptical than the early generations, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely sort of what would you say it? He's slumping toward the Enlightenment, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
slumping isn't even a strong enough term.
Yeah, the sort of grand metaphysics of the medieval period, right? I mean, these are like again, Alexander Hales, Bonaventure, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great. These guys are like, believe in being and real essences, and I mean,
Hmm.
this is like, the grand metaphysical systems, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Occam's just not into that. Like
Yeah.
he wants to tear all that down. He thinks a lot of it's nonsense. There's a sort of a kind of an edgy empirical side to Occam that he's going to get rid of universals, real essences. His views about morality ultimately end up in voluntarism. You sort of teleology fades away. I mean, all of the sort of what I would consider the hallmarks of the great medieval metaphysical systems, right? He tends to undermine, right? And so when I think about that creative retrieval, whether it's Neoplatonic, more Aristotelian, or something in between, or something kind of like Anselm, I think of it as a project of trying to unify man, society, and being under a hierarchy of causes that has its apex in God, right?
Yeah. Right.
I
And
that's
Occam's not in that.
Yeah, I mean that's medieval philosophy. That's
Hmm.
what these guys are doing. That's the Middle Ages, right? Is this sort of unifying, right? Bringing things to where they're consistent with each other, not flattening them out. That's like the distinctions stay in place, right? Medieval men were people who believed in distinctions and distinct
Yeah.
roles and all that kind of thing, right? Uh, but unified still under a hierarchy of causes, however you want to sort of structure that. It could be exemplar causes, it could be Dionysian forms, could be, more of a Thomist account, but that has its apex in God,
Hmm.
right?
So let me bring you back to an earlier point that
Okay.
you made, right, about them all being Christians.
Okay.
So people would push back against that. Moses Maimonides,
Mhm.
um, so I mean, he's in this period, right? He's medieval, and
Sure, I
he's
would
from
see
Spain.
him as medieval, and so, but I would just say he's not part. This is a little controversial, but he's not part of European civilization, really. Now, in saying that, I understand how fraught that issue can be, but he's on the. I mean, it's fraught because it's true, right? He's on
Uh,
the margins of European civilization, right? I don't see him as part of Western Christendom, right? Directly, right? Is he
yeah.
connected to it? Sure,
I
right?
mean, Thomas dialogued with him, not personally, but I mean, like,
Sure. Mhm. He uses them and he uses Islamic philosophers too, right?
right, Islamic
Um,
philosophers. Okay,
sure.
yeah. So Islamic
But again,
philosophers clearly aren't in Europe,
right.
but they were definitely their thinking was hugely influential, though.
Sure. I agree. I agree. Um, and I would say its reception, though, wasn't without criticism, right? That
Yeah.
is, I think there was, and Thomas is very, and I'm always happy to bring this in, to sort of recognize that there are civilizations, right?
Hmm.
And that there are particular civilizational spirits isn't at the same time to say that there's no interconnectivity or interrelations between civilizations, right?
Hmm.
So I think you can say that Islamic civilization influenced Western civilization. By the way, it also went in the other direction too.
Yeah.
Um, but they were distinct civilizations.
Uh-huh.
And I think you can see that again from language to military tactics to warfare to judicial systems, all of those sort of things. I mean, I think again, is there some overlap? Sure. But is there a real distinction? I would say yes, there is.
schools of thought in terms of interpretation of Aristotle, though, right?
Mhm.
They there was a sort of crystallization around certain Islamic interpreters,
Sure.
the Averroists, for example, right?
Mhm.
And Thomas kind of goes to he takes it up with them.
Right. I think the Averroists lose, I think, in the
Yeah.
long term, right? I mean, especially by 1277, they've lost big time, right?
Hmm.
Which again, I think shows that they weren't really part of that. They were sort of acting in a way that wasn't in keeping fully with that spirit, which was, I think, ecclesiastical, Catholic, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. Maybe not in every, not maybe not, in every stated premise, right? But again, the premises don't just pop out of the blue. It's as if the premises just generate themselves, right? Obviously, there's men who generate the premises of the arguments, right? And those men are Catholic men, right? For the most part. Right?
So maybe in our audience, some of our listeners aren't really familiar with that debate about the Averroists in the Middle Ages. Um, can you maybe fill us in about that a little bit? What was the issue that Thomas had with the Averroists?
Yeah. So, and to try to put it just sort of in a clear and concise way, there's obviously a lot of details, right,
Hmm.
that would need to be examined. But to put it in a clear and concise way, the um, the theory of the two truths, I think, is probably what you would want to focus on as being probably the most important. And that's the view, right, that there are certain things found in philosophy through certain conclusions, very importantly, not just opinions, but philosophically demonstrated conclusions that are not consistent with Christian faith,
Hmm.
and that that's okay, and that the same person can affirm these contrary theses, right? Um, and without disobeying or dissenting from the faith, right?
Yeah. So that kind of goes to a kind of voluntaristic understanding of God that you find in Islam,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, you could think
Which
that way.
doesn't exist in Christianity.
Mm,
And by which I mean that God is so transcendent that he transcends even consistency with reason, right?
mm.
That basically God is reducible to his act of will. He
Right. That's
chooses,
what you, yeah.
right? Um, and uh, and so if he chooses for the world to have a divided rationality, well, that's just fine. He can
Which
do
is
that.
fine. Yeah. Yeah. It's
Now,
also, go ahead.
the in so toward the end of the Middle Ages, right, when you get into the Renaissance period, what
Mm,
Galileo actually gets in trouble for isn't his theory about the solar system, it's his theory about truth,
right.
right? It's his belief. He actually ascribes to that view that there can be
Mm,
two different avenues to truth with two completely different conclusions to be drawn.
yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Uh, I can't remember right now exactly who sort of supported this idea. It's about 10, 15 years ago, but in some ways anticipates sort of a kind of methodological pluralism, right? That's supposed to
Mhm.
kind of save you maybe from relativism, but I'm not really sure that it does,
Uh,
right? So you say, well, while I'm doing my science, I believe, I come to this conclusion, right? But then I stop doing this science and I go over here and I pray and I think otherwise, right? That's there's a kind of like inconsistency, right?
yeah, it doesn't get you out of that
Existential
problem.
level there that just seems like implausible, right?
I think what you would say is what you could say, I think. Now I'm speaking here as a what? Am I speaking as a theologian or as a philosopher? Um, I would say that you could say that given the narrow given the narrowly circumscribed methodology of
Mm,
science, within these premises, these are the conclusions that would appear to follow. However, there are premises unavailable to science,
mm,
um, which, if introduced, though that would be contrary to their methodology, would yield would call those conclusions into question.
right. Right.
Um, which makes you think, well, then what is the nature of those conclusions?
Mhm.
Well, they're conclusions only within a system of thought, right? A sort of intellectual model but you're saying that they're not reflective of ontology. Maybe
Mm.
maybe that's what you would say.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some interesting ways to try to deal with that, right?
Uh-huh.
But I think that the certainly the two truths, version of sort of the so-called Latin Averroist is too problematic to
Yeah,
accept.
it's incompatible with faith, I would say.
Right. And I think that, kind of the kind of shifting methodologies and I mean, I do think there is room for, I mean, I do this, say, when I try to think about philosophy and I'm dealing with a philosopher who I think is wrong, right? I
Hmm.
still try to take on his mind while I'm studying him,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And that's a methodological sort of distinction. So those things can be thought through to some degree. But in terms of the overarching picture here, right? I certainly to go back, think that the Islamic sources are very important. I think particularly, obviously, Ibn Sina for Thomas Aquinas. Um, but at the same time, I think in kind of like the how do you call it, the treasures of Egypt kind of
Hmm.
way, right? That the Christian takes the treasures of Egypt, rightly so, because they belong to God. Insofar as they're true, we can take them, right? And but then makes them part of our own project, right? Another example of this that I think is kind of funny is Thomas's we talked about this in a podcast, but Thomas's appropriation of Aristotle and talking about the Eucharist, right? Some critics of that will say, "Oh, Thomas is so terrible; he's Aristotelianizing the Eucharist." like Aristotle would totally disagree with everything Aquinas is saying
Yeah,
about the
he
Eucharist,
just
right?
threw Aristotle under the bus.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, he's saying that substance isn't known through the accidents in this case, right? Which is not an Aristotelian thesis,
Yeah,
right?
right, right.
So, anyways, I
I
think
guess
it's
an analogy to what you're saying, right, with by pointing to saying Maimonides is not really part of the Christian European tradition,
Mhm.
which I could picture the explosions in the background as we talk. People can really flame that. But but let me try to understand what you're saying here, right? The to say that he's not really part of the Western the European philosophical tradition, um, but he's sort of his own thing, right?
Mhm.
If you imagine sort of Judaism being culturally ghettoized within the
Right.
intellectual milieu at this time,
Hmm.
and the Islamic philosophers are doing their own thing.
Hmm.
Maybe an analogy would be going back to the time of the primitive church. You would see maybe Hellenized Judaism, um, and and you would say, well, certainly in Hellenistic Judaism, the Jews, many of whom here become Christians, have appropriated a great deal from the Greek philosophical milieu. That's why we call them
Yes.
Hellenists.
Yes.
But fundamentally, that's not really the shape of their thought.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a good analogy. Again, there's always going to be um, places where kind of like the tectonic plates of the earth rub against each other and kind
Yeah.
of grind
Hmm.
on each other and affect each other, right? So I do think that happens with civilizations and movements of thought and traditions, but um, that doesn't change the fact that there are separate tectonic plates,
Hmm.
right? And I think the same thing with or distinct, if you prefer, these distinct civilizations, distinct um, medieval ways of thinking, right? Or what I'm calling, medieval philosophy. I mean, if one wants to sort of say, well, it's all one thing because it's at the same time, I'm not going to, yeah, okay, fine. If that's your project and you want to do it that way, that's fine. I think that that would misrepresent, though, the degree to which this is a unique um, part of a unique civilizational building project.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, so I don't really see a problem here. You, we could cast, we could put a whole range of lenses over this period of time.
mhm.
But this is, you're putting a particular lens over it, right?
Right. One that I
And
think that the majority of the men we're talking about would have identified with more.
mhm,
They saw themselves as part of Christendom, right?
right, right,
They saw them part of themselves and like thought about the West. They wouldn't even call it the West, but they just call it the church, right?
yeah,
As this fundamental reality of which they're a part.
right, right. So let me kind of bring this to the contemporary period.
Okay.
Um, 20th century saw late 19th, early 20th century, right, up to really, the even through the Second Vatican Council period, right, you saw this what we call the ressourcement.
Hmm.
Um, and interestingly, as a historical phenomenon, the ressourcement finds its roots in the Leonine Thomistic revival, right? So Leo the 13th said that we need to study Thomas
Right.
and really pushed in that direction hard for the church. So people did. And what they found in Thomas was exactly what you're describing. Now, obviously, this isn't unique to Thomas, as you yourself were pointing out. This is really the spirit of the age.
Right.
But what they found in Thomas was a person who made as broad a use as possible of all the sources he could recover
Hmm.
from the tradition.
Hmm.
If there was a father of the church writing something that was relevant to the theological question in front of him, he wanted to read it.
Sure.
Now, his library was a lot smaller than ours,
Oh yeah. Right.
right? So by the time you had the late 19th, early 20th century, archaeology had recovered. If you want to talk about that actual recovery in the spirit of medieval philosophy,
Hmm.
we'd recovered a lot of material,
Sure. Yeah.
right?
I
Think of
agree.
all the Patrologia series in
Hmm.
Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in Coptic
Hmm.
that were being produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the cataloging of patristic ecclesiastical documents, right? Like you
Hmm.
find in Mansi, right? This huge
Sure.
encyclopedic, massive folio volumes, right, of church text. That was
Right.
now all available to us. And so the ressourcement, um, they decided that they were gonna read that stuff, you know,
Mhm.
and incorporate it into their thinking. To me, right, when I think of the 20th century, I kind of think of it as being a lot like the 13th century for that sort of a reason.
Hmm. Interesting.
Um, so what points of continuity or discontinuity do you think you might find in the ressourcement? I'm just throwing it
Interesting
out to
question.
you.
I'm not really prepared for it. I have to think about it for a second. Um, I mean, I think that there are, of course, so you can slice this question in terms of methodology or doctrine, I think.
Mhm,
And I do think in terms of methodology, um, you can find some continuity there, right? Certainly, I myself sometimes like to say, as a follower of Thomas, that I'm greedy for insights.
uh-huh,
And so I'm happy to read all sorts of people outside of what I would consider my tradition, um, because they might have something true to say, right?
mhm,
And Thomas, like I try to weave those into my own sort of synthesis to some degree, right? Now, I will say, even speaking that way, might put me a little different position than some followers of Thomas,
mhm,
um, or other, scholastics. Um, as in, I'm talking about a process of synthesizing, right? Rather than a process of reiterating, or as distinct from that. Um, I think good philosophers are always doing that. In terms of ressourcement, though, and say, you know, um, it kind of depends. I would tend to think that the ressourcement doctrinally, if I wasn't to try to, if I was trying to avoid narrowing down to one particular form of medieval philosophy, right?
Hmm.
So I could say certain things, right, as a Thomist that might be different in terms of doctrine. But if I
Uh,
was talking about medieval philosophy, as I have been,
the
right,
spirit of medieval philosophy. Yeah.
right, I would I would actually probably cite what John Paul II says in Fides et Ratio,
Hmm.
uh, which where he says of phenomenology, right, that in itself it doesn't contain sufficient metaphysical content.
Hmm.
And I would say about the ressourcement that for all of its good and all of its retrieval, I think it tended to have a phenomenological and existential sort of um, cast,
Uh,
which isn't bad. There's nothing wrong with that. I think, though, it is less engaged with, say, real essences than Dionysius was,
yeah.
right? So that's where I would see sort of a difference. But, and again, that's not even really meant to be a criticism. It's more of an observation.
Uh,
I don't expect, and nobody should expect, men in the 21st century to only speak and think like men in the 13th century or men in the 12th century
mhm.
for a very important reason because they're not,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
They simply are different men in a different time and in a different civilization. I think that um, you can try, like, is it wrong-headed for von Balthasar to be bringing in a bunch of Heideggerian sort of considerations? I don't think so, except insofar as Heidegger may be false, right?
Yeah.
Notice the way I
Uh,
phrase that, right? Maybe, right? So
he's
I'm
right
open
about some
to,
things, right?
yeah, right. I'm open to, to that project. Doesn't mean that I'll think it always gets it right, or that I think it always gets it wrong.
Yeah.
But
So
of
when I
course,
think of
it
the,
makes sense for 20th century theologians
mhm.
to be aware of and engage with um, the philosophy of their times.
Yeah, so this is actually it's an interesting point. We could have a whole different podcast on this, right? But the distinction between the ressourcement as a project and the aggiornamento as a project, right? So when you talk about the introduction of Heideggerian lines of thought or Schillerian lines of thought, right? Um, I would call that more a question of aggiornamento than ressourcement. In other words, attempting to sort of articulate our thinking in a new contemporary philosophical context. But the project of the ressourcement is the recovery of the ancient sources. And those two things historically mostly went hand in hand. Now, I would say that some real points of deviation occurred where you had some people engaged in what they thought was aggiornamento without actually being particularly careful ressourcement theologians. And they ended up introducing terrible distortions. But for people like, I want to say, Balthasar and Ratzinger, um, and de Lubac, they were both engaged in an aggiornamento project and also um, the ressourcement, right? So when I think of the ressourcement, I think they're kind of doing what Thomas would have done. If he had such a big library, he would have read from it.
Sure.
And he would have attempted to discover as best he could from his own vantage point how these people thought, right? What were they thinking when they said these things? How did they intend these words to be understood? Um, and what relevance do they have for me today in receiving the Christian tradition? That's what Thomas would have done. And I think that that's kind of what the ressourcement theologians were attempting to accomplish. So I, when I think of this spirit of medieval philosophy, to me, it's it has a continuing relevance to us, not just as a historical artifact, but as a
Mhm.
lesson in terms of how to engage the world.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Of course, I think that's true. I think that's true. I would say methodologically and doctrinally. in the sense that I think the um, although it doesn't answer all of the questions, obviously, I think the sort of the human I think the human desire for metaphysical truth,
Mhm.
right, and for a metaphysical answer, right, is always there potentially. I think man can run from that for a good bit, but at
Mhm.
some point we simply want to know being. And I think that's where, you really want to know, is there such a thing as the soul, right?
Yeah.
Is the soul a real entity? Do I actually continue to exist afterwards? Not just kind of what does it mean for me or that, sort of what kind of values does that bespeak, but like, is it true
Yeah.
that
It's not that
that
those questions aren't important, right? The
Hmm,
what does it mean to me or what value does it? But
sure.
this question is also important.
That's
And
right.
and
That's the way I
it's
would put it. Yeah.
yeah, and it's an indispensable one ultimately.
Right. So one of the we had a really great one of the probably discussions in the medieval philosophy class that was really good. I just taught was on the question of the ultimate end,
Hmm.
and that's a very like that's something that always appeals to human beings, right? There's always that like that's existentially significant. Like, what is the ultimate purpose? What's the ultimate end? What's the ultimate goal? Is there anything? And of course, medieval philosophers can give an answer to that, but all of those answers have really important metaphysical elements, right? None of
Hmm.
those answers make any sense, whether it's Bonaventure's ascent to God or, Thomas's view of the ultimate end, right, in the Beatific Vision. None of those make any sense without the metaphysical truths that are built into their answers. And so that's one of the things that medieval philosophy can do. It can say not only would you find um, your ultimate happiness in knowing and loving God as He is in Himself, and you can kind of make an account for that, but also, is there a God out there for us to know and
Right,
love,
right.
right? That kind of thing. So I think what it would definitely definitely add. One other area I will say, just as we're getting ready to close here, that medieval philosophy continues to have a lot, I think, of resonance is it specifically in the moral area
Hmm.
and in issues about political life. That's one area that sometimes gets the political life part often gets neglected, unfortunately. I think that medieval philosophy has a lot to say to political life that would sort of provide maybe some angles and insights that are a
Hmm.
little outside of our current ideological paradigms, which could only be helpful. CST, Catholic Social Teaching at its best, right? Not
Hmm.
everything that travels under that name, but like the genuine article is quite, I think good at that sort of thing. And in a lot of ways, it's not just a repetition of medieval philosophy, but certainly uses a lot of elements of medieval philosophy. And then similarly in moral theology or moral philosophy, you know, I think I think the medieval scholastic analysis of the moral act is pretty well unsurpassed in terms of a model of evaluating a human action, in terms of its rigor, its analytic excellence.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
John Paul II insisted on bringing that back, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and a lot of I think that's one of the things people disliked
people
about him the
disliked about him,
most.
yeah. Um,
Right? But anyways,
but I mean, he was, and he was one of those people who he would certainly be open, much as as medieval philosophers would. He would certainly
Mhm.
be open to a different philosophical paradigm if he found one that was more serviceable than those that he had in
Mhm.
front of him. But, in this case, he just didn't see one available.
Right.
So, this paradigm of talking about object, intention, and circumstance and the
Mhm.
moral act was indispensable for articulating a Christian morality.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And is, yeah, to this day, until otherwise, right. But I think, I think one of the things people dislike about it is its kind of rigor and aspiration towards objectivity, right? That
Oh yeah,
we can really say, no, this was a bad act, and I can give you a very rigorous explanation
as to
for why
why,
this
yeah.
is a bad act.
Regardless of how
Right?
you felt or what you may have intended, or what the outcome was, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, but here's what, where I would say you talked about, is it true? Is there
Mm,
really being? Is there a
right.
God, right? Well, this is part of that whole thing, right? Isn't it? That
Mm,
there's moral truth.
right. Yeah. Hmm.
Moral reasoning isn't something we do that's fundamentally different as if it comes from a different organ or a different faculty from reason
Hmm.
itself. It's an
Right.
act of reason about moral objects.
Right.
That only makes sense if we think there's real being, and even in the moral arena.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's the those areas are areas where medieval philosophy continues to contribute. I
Mhm.
think along with other traditions and strains of things.
All right. Well, Dr. Smith, it's been a long and involved and very interesting conversation.
I hope so.
So thanks a lot for leading us through it. And I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it. Um,
Thanks a lot,
all
Rich.
right.
I enjoyed doing it.
Yep. Okay. So thanks for listening, you in the audience, and don't forget to check out Dr. Smith's Logos letter in his Substack, and don't forget to like and subscribe and all those other things, and check us out on Patreon. God bless.